Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever looked at a family, a home, a life so perfectly polished, and felt a quiet, nagging unease? A feeling that beneath the gleaming surface, something dark and heavy was being carefully hidden. We often tell ourselves it's just envy, a flaw in our own perception. But secrets, you see, have a weight. They press down on the foundations of a home until the floorboards creak and the walls begin to warp. They poison the air, subtly at first, then all at once. The story we are about to explore is about a house like that, a family like that, a place where the pursuit of perfection became a sickness, and where the darkest secret of all was simmering on the stove, served with a smile to unsuspecting guests. Our story takes place in Maple Creek, Ohio. If you were to design the perfect American suburb in a laboratory, it would look a lot like Maple Creek. The town was a postcard of autumnal bliss. Oak and maple trees lined the quiet streets, their leaves a riot of gold, crimson, and burnt orange. White picket fences stood as gentle, symbolic guardians to manicured lawns. On any given afternoon, you could hear the distant laughter of children playing in their backyards and the soft, rhythmic creak of a porch swing. It was a place built on the promise of safety, community, and the simple, achievable dream of a happy life. And at the very heart of this idyllic dream, on the corner of Elm Street and Orchard Lane, stood the Vance residence. It was a handsome two-story colonial, painted a tasteful shade of dove gray with crisp white trim. A perfectly symmetrical wreath of autumn foliage hung on the glossy black door. The windows gleamed like promises kept. To the neighbors, the Vances were not just residents. They were an aspiration. They were the living embodiment of the Maple Creek ideal. Richard Vance was a successful sales executive, a man with a dazzling smile and an easy charm that could put anyone at ease. He was the kind of man who remembered your name after a single meeting, who always had a good-natured joke ready, and who mowed his lawn in perfectly straight lines every Saturday morning. He was the golden husband, the proud father. His wife, Eleanor, was his perfect counterpart. She was beautiful in a quiet, understated way. Her movements were always graceful, her home always immaculate. She was a master baker, a gifted gardener, and the kind of mother who organized the most creative playdates and volunteered for every school bake sale. She ran her household with a serene efficiency that was the envy of every other woman on the block. Together with their 1-year-old daughter, Lily, a cherubic baby with Richard's bright eyes, they formed a perfect trinity. But there was a fourth member of the family, a slight imperfection in the otherwise flawless portrait. His name was Leo. Leo was 8 years old, Richard's son from his first marriage. He was a bright, energetic boy with a mop of unruly brown hair and a constant scrape on one of his knees. He was a reminder of a past that didn't quite fit the pristine narrative of the new Vance family. Though Eleanor treated him with a measured kindness and Richard with a sometimes forced joviality, Leo was an element from a different equation, a variable that couldn't quite be solved. The story begins, as so many tragedies do, on a perfectly normal day. It was a crisp Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. The air was filled with the rich, smoky scent of burning leaves. Eleanor was hosting one of her famous neighborhood potlucks. The backyard was filled with neighbors, their voices a low, happy hum of conversation. Children chased each other across the green lawn, their laughter like tiny bells. Richard moved through the crowd, a glass of bourbon in his hand, his charisma holding everyone captive. Eleanor was a picture of the perfect hostess. She glided from group to group, ensuring everyone's plate was full, their glass never empty. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and jeans, yet she looked effortlessly elegant. Her smile was warm, her words gracious. But if you looked closely, truly looked, you might have noticed something amiss. Her smile, though perfectly formed, didn't quite reach her eyes. Her eyes, a lovely shade of hazel, held a strange emptiness, a placid void that the surrounding joy couldn't seem to penetrate. Her movements, while graceful, were also precise, almost robotic, as if she were following a script only she could read. The centerpiece of the gathering, as always, was Eleanor's signature dish, her slow-cooked beef stew. It was legendary in Maple Creek. The meat was so tender it fell apart with a fork, and the broth was a complex, savory masterpiece that people whispered about for days afterward. Today, the large cast-iron pot sat on an outdoor serving table, steam rising from it in fragrant clouds. "Eleanor, you've outdone yourself again," said Martha, their next-door neighbor, taking a hearty spoonful. "You simply must give me the recipe one day." Eleanor gave a small, Practice laugh. Oh, Martha. You know I can't. It's an old family secret. Her eyes flickered for a moment, a brief, unreadable shadow passing through them before the placid mask returned. Richard came up behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist. My wife, the culinary genius, he announced to the small group nearby. She keeps the magic all to herself. He kissed her temple, a public display of affection that made the neighbors sigh with admiration. They were the perfect couple. It was Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow from across the street with sharp eyes and an even sharper memory, who first noticed the absence. Such a lovely party. Eleanor, she said, her voice thin and reedy. But where is little Leo? I haven't seen him all afternoon. Is he feeling under the weather? A momentary silence fell over the small group. Richard was the first to speak, his tone smooth as silk. Oh, Sarah picked him up a day early. Brenda, he said, using his ex-wife's name with casual ease. They're going on some pre-Thanksgiving camping trip. You know Sarah, always one for the great outdoors. He chuckled, a sound meant to convey shared, good-natured exasperation with a difficult ex. Eleanor nodded, her smile fixed in place. Yes. Leo was so excited. He couldn't wait to go. The explanation was simple, plausible. The neighbors accepted it without a second thought. The conversation drifted to other topics: the upcoming holiday, the local high school football team, the unusually mild weather. The tiny crack in the perfect facade had been expertly plastered over. But later, as the party began to wind down and the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose, Mrs. Gable approached Richard as he was clearing empty bottles from a table. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. Richard, dear, I don't mean to pry, but I heard the strangest noise coming from your garage last night. Quite late. It was. Richard paused, his smile unwavering. Oh, what kind of noise? Brenda. Well, she hesitated, her brow furrowed. It's silly. I know. But it sounded almost like a wood chipper. A very powerful one. It went on for quite some time. The air around Richard seemed to grow cold for a fraction of a second. His smile tightened. Just a fraction. But then, just as quickly, his easy charm returned. He let out a hearty laugh. A wood chipper. Brenda, you have quite the imagination. No, that was just me. We had that big storm last week, and a huge branch came down from the old oak. I was just in the garage. You see, using my new electric saw to cut it down into manageable pieces for the fireplace. Must have sounded louder than I thought. I do apologize if it disturbed you. The explanation was, once again, perfectly logical. Mrs. Gable looked relieved. Oh, of course. That makes sense. A saw. Silly me. She patted his arm and ambled back toward her own home. Richard watched her go, the smile finally fading from his face. He turned and looked at his own house. Through the large kitchen window, he could see Eleanor. She was standing at the sink, her back to the yard, washing the large cast-iron pot. She moved with the same methodical, unhurried precision she applied to everything. She scrubbed and rinsed, her focus absolute, as if she were cleansing not just a piece of cookware, but a memory, an act, a soul. The last of the guests departed, offering their thanks for a wonderful afternoon. The Vance house was quiet once more. Richard stepped inside, the scent of the stew still lingering in the air, thick and cloying. He found Eleanor in the living room, gently rocking the baby, Lily, who had just woken from her nap. The house was spotless. Every plate was washed, every glass put away. It was as if the party had never happened. Eleanor looked up at him, her face a pale, beautiful mask. There were no questions in her eyes, no fear, no guilt. There was only that vast, calm emptiness. Outside, a gust of wind sent a shower of dead leaves skittering across the pristine lawn. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked, marking the passage of time, one silent second after another. An 8-year-old boy was missing from this perfect home, from this perfect family. But here, inside these walls, it was as if he had never existed at all. The erasure was complete. The new beginning had been consecrated. The narrator's voice returns, a quiet undercurrent beneath the story's deceptive calm. This, viewers, is not just a story about a missing child. We've all seen those heartbreaking headlines, the desperate pleas from grieving parents on the evening news, This is a journey into a different kind of darkness. It is a meticulous exploration of a poisoned mind, a fractured soul consumed by the monster's obsession with perfection. It's an examination of how a man's casual cruelty and a woman's buried trauma could combine to create an evil so domestic, so ordinary, that it could be served on a dinner plate. We invite you to stay with us, to follow this path to its horrifying conclusion, and to discover the truly unspeakable truth hidden within the secret recipe of Maple Creek's most beloved stew. The lie settled over the Vance household like a fine layer of dust, invisible unless you knew where to look. For Richard and Eleanor, the following days were a performance of masterful subtlety. They went about their routines with a practiced normalcy that bordered on the surreal. Richard left for work each morning in his polished sedan, waving to neighbors. Eleanor took Lily for walks in the stroller, smiling at other young mothers in the park. They were a portrait of serene domesticity. The space where Leo should have been his empty seat at the dinner table, the silence from his usually noisy bedroom, the untouched video game controller on the coffee table was simply ignored. It was a vacuum they refused to acknowledge, a ghost they had collectively agreed not to see. Richard was the architect of this chilling peace. He was a man who believed that any inconvenience, any unpleasantness, could be overcome by simply deciding it did not exist. His first marriage had been an inconvenience. His son, a living, breathing reminder of that failure, had become the ultimate inconvenience. He had never explicitly told Eleanor what to do. He didn't need to. He was a sculptor of moods, a planter of ideas. For months, he had cultivated the soil of Eleanor's obsessive mind. He would sigh, seemingly to himself, while looking at a family photo. "It's almost perfect," he'd murmur, just loud enough for her to hear. Almost. When Leo would have a tantrum or track mud into the house, Richard wouldn't get angry. He would simply look at Eleanor with a sad, weary expression. "He has so much of her in him," he'd say, the name of his ex-wife hanging in the air like a curse. I wish we could have a clean slate. Just us. A real family." He had handed Eleanor a problem, wrapped in the language of love and longing, and trusted her damaged psyche to find a solution. A final solution. Eleanor, for her part, found a strange sense of tranquility in the aftermath. The gnawing anxiety that had been her constant companion for years had vanished. The source of the imperfection was gone. Her home was finally, truly, hers. Her family was pure. She moved through her days with a newfound lightness. She baked elaborate cakes. She rearranged the furniture. She sang lullabies to Lily with a clear, sweet voice. She was tending to her perfect world, weeding out the last of the unpleasantness. The garage had been scrubbed with bleach until the concrete floor was pale and sterile. The new electric saw and several heavy-duty garbage bags had been disposed of at a dumpster behind a strip mall 2 towns over. Every detail had been attended to. Her mind, once a chaotic storm of insecurities, was now a calm, orderly space. The first tremor that threatened their fabricated peace came on Sunday evening. Precisely at 7 p.m., the phone rang. Its shrill sound an intrusion into the quiet sanctuary of their home. Richard glanced at the caller ID. It was Sarah. He let it ring twice before answering, his voice a careful blend of warmth and mild annoyance. "Sarah, everything all right?" he asked. Sarah Jenkins's voice was tight, a wire pull taut. "Richard, where is he? Where's Leo? He was supposed to be here hours ago." Richard feigned surprise, a skill he had honed over years in sales. "What are you talking about? He's with you. You picked him up Saturday morning for your camping trip." A cold silence on the other end of the line. Then, Sarah's voice, laced with disbelief and rising panic. "What camping trip? Richard, what are you talking about? I haven't seen or spoken to Leo since last Wednesday. We had no plans. You know I have to work this weekend. You were supposed to bring him to my place this evening. That was the arrangement." Richard held the phone, his knuckles white. He glanced at Eleanor, who was watching him from the doorway, her expression unreadable. He turned his back to her, lowering his voice into a tone of concerned confidence. "Sarah, calm down. Let's not get hysterical. Leo packed his bags Saturday morning. He told me you were picking him up early. He seemed excited. Maybe his plans got mixed up. Did you check with your mother? Maybe you told him to go there. Don't you dare patronize me. Richard." Sarah's voice was shaking now, with fury and fear. "My son is missing. He is not with me. He is not with my mother. He was with you and your new wife. Where is he? Listen." He's probably just at a friend's house. You know how he is, Richard said, his voice a soothing balm of condescension. Let's give it an hour. I'm sure he'll turn up. Boys will be boys. If I don't hear from you in 30 minutes, Richard, I'm calling the police, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper. Then she hung up. Richard slowly lowered the phone. The performance was over. He turned to face Eleanor. Her calm was unnerving. She simply stood there, rocking Lily gently in her arms. She knows, Richard said. The words flat. Eleanor nodded. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. It was bound to happen, she said, her voice as soft as a breeze. It doesn't change anything. The house is clean. Our family is clean. 30 minutes later, true to her word, Sarah Jenkins called the Maple Creek Police Department and reported her 8-year-old son, Leo Vance, missing. The first official crack appeared in the perfect facade of the house on Elm Street. Detective Isabella Rossi, known to everyone as Izzy, got the call just as she was finishing a mountain of paperwork. Izzy was new to Maple Creek. She had transferred from a high-stress, high-crime precinct in Chicago a year ago. Hoping for a quieter life, she had traded the shriek of sirens for the chirp of crickets, the grim cityscapes for tree-lined streets. So far, her caseload had consisted of 2 teenage shoplifters, a series of garden gnome thefts, and a dispute between neighbors over a fallen tree branch. A missing child case was a jolt, a grim reminder of the world she thought she had left behind. She drove her unmarked sedan through the quiet, darkened streets of Maple Creek. When she pulled up to the Vance residence, the house was lit up, a beacon of warmth and welcome in the autumn night. It looked like the kind of house where nothing bad could ever happen. Izzy had been a cop long enough to know that those were usually the most dangerous houses of all. Richard Vance opened the door before she even had a chance to ring the bell. He had composed himself perfectly. His face was a mask of worried concern. He invited her in, his manners impeccable. Eleanor was sitting on the sofa, holding the sleeping baby. She looked pale and distressed, the very picture of a worried stepmother. Detective, thank you for coming so quickly, Richard began, his voice earnest. We're terribly worried. His mother just called. We had no idea. Izzy took in the scene. The house was immaculate, almost sterile. Not a cushion was out of place. Not a speck of dust was visible on the gleaming hardwood floors. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom. She sat in the armchair they offered her, her eyes scanning the room, absorbing details. They recounted their version of the story, their words practiced and synchronized. Leo had become increasingly difficult lately. They explained. He was acting out, jealous of the new baby. He had mentioned a camping trip with his mother. They had assumed it was all arranged. They had helped him pack his little backpack on Saturday morning. They hadn't seen him since. They had just assumed he was safe with his mother. So, you didn't see Ms. Jenkins pick him up? Izzy asked, her gaze fixed on Eleanor. Eleanor shook her head, clutching Lily a little tighter. No, she whispered. Leo said she was meeting him at the end of the street. He wanted to walk by himself. He's been very independent lately, trying to prove he's a big boy. It was a good lie. It was plausible, but it was also convenient. Too convenient. Izzy's instincts, honed by years of interrogating Chicago's most accomplished liars, began to scream. And you didn't think to call his mother, just to confirm the plans? Izzy pressed, her tone gentle but firm. Richard stepped in, placing a protective hand on Eleanor's shoulder. Detective, you have to understand our situation. My ex-wife and I, our relationship can be contentious. We try to communicate through Leo as much as possible, to shield him from any conflict. Calling to confirm would have likely started an argument. We were just respecting what we thought were her wishes. He painted a picture of 2 reasonable adults, trying to navigate a difficult co-parenting situation, with Leo caught in the middle. It was another masterful performance. But Izzy Rossi wasn't watching the performance. She was watching their eyes. She saw the way Richard's gaze never wavered, a sign of either absolute truthfulness or deep-seated sociopathy. And she saw the unnerving emptiness in Eleanor's, a calm that was profoundly out of place for a mother whose stepson was missing. The story they told was perfect, but the feeling in the room was all wrong. A deep, chilling cold emanated from the very heart of this perfect family, and Izzy knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was standing at the edge of a terrible abyss. The search for Leo Vance had begun, but the detective suspected she wasn't just looking for a missing boy. She was hunting for a monster that wore a human face. The official search for Leo Vance began the next morning under a sky the color of slate. The idyllic town of Maple Creek awoke to a jarring new reality. Police cruisers, their lights silently flashing, lined the curbs of Elm Street. Uniformed officers conducted a grid search through the neatly trimmed hedges and manicured flower beds, their presence a stark violation of the neighborhood's carefully curated tranquility. The Vance house, once a symbol of suburban aspiration, was now cordoned off with yellow police tape, a lurid scar on the face of the perfect street. Detective Izzy Rossi coordinated the effort from the back of her car, a makeshift command center filled with coffee cups and precinct maps. She had been up all night, piecing together the initial timeline, and the inconsistencies were piling up like dead leaves in a gutter. The story told by Richard and Eleanor Vance was a smooth, polished stone, but the more she tried to grasp it, the more it slipped through her fingers. There were no calls or texts between Richard and Sarah confirming any camping trip. No friends of Leo had heard him mention it. The entire narrative rested solely on the word of the two people who were the last to see him. Her first official step was to re-interview them, separately this time. She started with Richard at the station, a sterile environment far from the controlled stage of his home, away from Eleanor. Richard's performance was even more refined. He was the image of a distraught father, his voice thick with carefully modulated grief and frustration. He artfully steered the conversation toward Sarah, planting seeds of doubt about her stability, her reliability. "Detective, I love my son more than anything," he said, leaning forward, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "But you have to understand Sarah. She can be volatile. She was never happy that I moved on, that I found happiness with Eleanor. She might have done this just to hurt me, to make us look bad. I wouldn't put it past her to have Leo hiding out a friend's house, just to create all this drama. It was a classic misdirection, and a clever one. It played on the common, messy tropes of divorced families." Izzy listened patiently, letting him talk. She had already run a background check. Sarah Jenkins had no record, not even a speeding ticket. She was a registered nurse in the county hospital with a sterling employment history. Richard, on the other hand, had been named in a messy lawsuit from his previous job, accused of embezzling funds. Though the case was dropped for lack of evidence, it was a small detail, but it suggested a man comfortable with deception. Izzy's interview with Eleanor took place in the Vance's kitchen. Eleanor had refused to leave the house, citing the baby's nap schedule. She sat at the polished granite island, a mug of herbal tea cradled in her hands. She was pale but composed. Her answers were identical to Richard's, almost word for word. She spoke of Leo's jealousy, his recent moodiness, his excitement about the fictional camping trip. Her delivery was flawless, her tone soft and sorrowful. But as she spoke, Izzy noticed something. Eleanor's hands were immaculate. Her nails were perfectly manicured, but the skin around her cuticles was red and raw, as if scrubbed mercilessly. And while she spoke of her worry for Leo, her eyes kept drifting around the kitchen to the gleaming stainless steel sink, the spotless countertops, the neatly organized spice rack. It was as if her primary concern was not the missing boy, but the pristine order of her domain. This house was her creation, her sanctuary, and the police presence was an intolerable stain upon its perfection. "Mrs. Vance," Izzy said, her voice gentle, "I need to ask for your permission to conduct a thorough search of the house and the grounds, and we'll need to take a look inside your vehicles as well. It's standard procedure." For the first time, a flicker of something other than placid calm appeared in Eleanor's eyes. It was a flash of cold, sharp panic. It was gone in an instant, replaced by her mask of cooperative sorrow. "Of course, detective," she said, her voice a little too high. "Whatever you need. We just want to find Leo." While the forensic team began their methodical work, Izzy met with Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was the complete opposite of the calm, collected Vances. She was a whirlwind of frantic energy and raw, unfiltered fear. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, and she paced the small waiting room of the station like a caged animal. "They're lying," she said, her voice ragged. "Richard is a magnificent liar. He can sell snow to an Eskimo, and he can sell the story to you. But I know my son. Leo would never, ever go anywhere without telling me. He wouldn't go camping without his asthma inhaler, for one thing. And he would never, ever leave behind Barnaby." "Barnaby?" Izzy asked, flipping open her notepad. "His teddy bear," Sarah explained, her voice cracking. "He's had it since he was a baby. It's old and tattered, and he'd be embarrassed for his friends to see it. but he sleeps with it every single night. It's his comfort object. When I dropped him off at Richard's on Friday, Barnaby was tucked into his backpack. I saw it myself. This was the first concrete piece of information that directly contradicted the Vance's story. If Leo had packed a bag to run away or go on a trip, Barnaby would have been the first thing he took. Izzy made a note. It was a small thing. A child's stuffed animal. But in a case built on lies, small things could break it wide open. Back at the house, the search was yielding frustratingly little. The home was, as Izzy had noted, unnaturally clean. Too clean. The forensic team commented that it was like a crime scene that had been professionally sanitized. There was not a stray hair or a forgotten fingerprint out of place. They searched Leo's room. His bed was neatly made. His clothes were folded in their drawers. On the surface, it looked like a room waiting for its occupant to return. But Izzy, guided by Sarah's information, looked deeper. She got down on her hands and knees, shining her flashlight into the dark space under the bed. And there, pushed far back against the wall, covered in a thin veil of dust, was a small, brown, one-eyed teddy bear. Barnaby. He was lying on his side, as if he'd been kicked there in a hurry. Izzy carefully placed the bear into an evidence bag. This was it. The first lie. Exposed. A boy on a camping trip would not have left his most treasured possession behind. This wasn't a story of a runaway. This was something else. Something much, much darker. The case began to attract media attention. A local news van was now permanently parked down the street from the Vance house. The story of the missing boy in the perfect suburb was compelling. In her press briefings, Izzy was careful, sticking to the facts, but in private, the pressure was mounting. The town of Maple Creek wanted answers. They wanted their sense of security restored. Sarah, growing more desperate by the hour, took matters into her own hands. She printed hundreds of missing flyers with Leo's smiling school picture on them. She and a group of her friends from the hospital blanketed the town, taping them to telephone poles, in shop windows, on community bulletin boards. One of those flyers was taped directly onto the white picket fence in front of the Vance house. The sight of her son's face on that fence, a silent accusation against the backdrop of that perfect home, was both a torment and a mission for Sarah. She would not let them forget him. She would not let them erase him. The flyer was a constant, visible reminder of the ugliness that had invaded their perfect world. Richard would tear it down each evening when he came home from work, his jaw tight with anger. But the next morning, a new one would be there in its place. Inside the house, Eleanor's calm began to fray at the edges. The police presence, the news vans, the flyer on her fencethi were all imperfections she could not control, stains she could not scrub away. Her carefully constructed reality was under assault. During this time, the narrative would occasionally shift, just for a moment, into Eleanor's perspective. We see the world through her distorted lens. The flyer is not a plea for a missing boy. It is an act of aggression from Sarah, a deliberate attempt to mar the beauty of her home. The police questions are not part of an investigation. They are rude, intrusive judgments on her housekeeping. One afternoon, as she rocks Lily in the nursery, a memory surfaces, unbidden and sharp. It's a fragment, disjointed and terrifying. A dark kitchen, much older than this one. The sharp, acrid smell of bleach. Her mother now. Her stepmother is scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees. Her movements frantic, angry. Eleanor is a little girl, maybe 5 years old, hiding in the pantry. She is watching through a crack in the door. She is looking for her little brother, David. He had been there just a moment ago, and now he was gone. Her stepmother keeps scrubbing, muttering to herself, making things clean. She says, over and over, have to make it all clean. The memory vanishes as quickly as it came, leaving Eleanor trembling, her heart pounding. She doesn't understand it. It feels like a scene from a nightmare, not a memory. She shakes her head, pushing it away, and focuses on the present. She looks down at the perfect, sleeping face of her daughter. Lily. This is what is real. This is what matters. Her new family. Her clean slate. She would protect it. She would protect it from anything and anyone. The discovery of the teddy bear shifted the investigation's center of gravity. It was no longer a simple missing person case. It was now a criminal investigation with two primary persons of interest, Richard and Eleanor Vance. Izzy Rossi felt the familiar, grim weight of such a case settle upon her. She was no longer just searching for a child. She was peeling back the layers of a family to find the sickness rotting within. The forensic report from the Vance house came back, and it was as frustrating as Izzy had expected. The place had been cleaned with a chemical precision that was, in itself, highly suspicious. They found traces of industrial-strength bleach in the kitchen and garage, far more than would be used for typical household cleaning. But there was no blood, no DNA, no physical evidence to tie the Vances to a violent crime. It was a dead end, meticulously constructed to be one. Their cars were similarly clean. Richard's sedan was freshly detailed, and Eleanor's minivan smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner. Izzy decided to change tactics. If the physical evidence was being concealed, she would have to focus on the psychological. She began digging deeper into the Vances' lives, interviewing friends, colleagues, and neighbors again, this time with a sharper focus. She wanted to understand the dynamics of the perfect blended family. The picture that emerged was disturbingly consistent. To the outside world, Eleanor was a saint. Friends described her as the most devoted stepmother, a woman who treated Leo as her own. They recounted her patient efforts to win him over, baking his favorite cookies, helping him with his homework. Richard was the doting husband, always praising Eleanor, always talking about how she had completed their family. It was a seamless, impenetrable wall of public perception. Only Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor from across the street, offered a small chink in the armor. Izzy visited her again, this time sitting in her cluttered, lavender-scented living room. They always seemed perfect, Mrs. Gable said, peering at Izzy over her spectacles. Almost a perfect. You know, like a picture in a magazine. But the boy, Leo, he didn't always seem happy. What do you mean? Izzy prompted. Well, he used to be so full of life when it was just him and his father. Right after they moved in, always shouting and running in the yard. After she moved in, Mrs. Gable said, her voice dropping slightly, he got quieter, more withdrawn. Sometimes I'd see him sitting on the porch steps, just staring into space, looking so lost. I remember one time, just a few weeks ago, I saw Eleanor scrubbing the front porch with a brush. Leo had tracked a little mud on it. The look on her face, it wasn't anger. It was something else, a kind of cold disgust. It frightened me a little. A cold disgust. The phrase stuck in Izzy's mind. It matched the unnerving emptiness she had seen in Eleanor's eyes. This wasn't about maternal discipline. This was about a pathological need for order, a revulsion to any form of imperfection. Meanwhile, Sarah Jenkins was becoming a force of nature. Her grief had galvanized into a fierce, relentless determination. She organized community search parties that combed the woods and parks surrounding Maple Creek. She gave a tearful, impassioned interview on the local news, holding up Leo's school picture, her voice pleading for any information. My son is not a runaway, she said, looking directly into the camera. He is a sweet, loving boy, and he is in danger. Someone knows something. Please, if you saw anything at all, call the police. Her public plea had an unintended consequence. It shattered the carefully constructed narrative Richard had tried to sell. The town's sympathy, which had initially been divided, now swung firmly to Sarah's side. The Vances became pariahs. Neighbors who had once shared potluck dinners now crossed the street to avoid them. Whispers followed them in the grocery store. The perfect family myth had crumbled, revealing the ugly suspicion beneath. The pressure was taking its toll, especially on Richard. His charm was a tool that required a receptive audience. Faced with the cold shoulders and suspicious glances of his community, it was useless. His world was predicated on being liked, admired. Now, he was a social outcast, the husband of a potential suspect in the disappearance of his own son. He became irritable, snapping at Eleanor over minor things. The mask was slipping. Inside the house, the atmosphere grew thick with unspoken tension. For Eleanor, the outside world's judgment was a secondary concern. Her primary battle was with the encroaching chaos. The police had disrupted her order. The neighbors' whispers were a discordant noise in her symphony of domestic perfection. Her home no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a fortress under siege. Her fragmented memories of the past began to surface more frequently, triggered by the smallest things. The smell of bleach from the laundry room would transport her back to that dark, terrifying kitchen from her childhood. She'd see her stepmother's face, twisted with a strange, manic glee. She would hear a phantom cry that sounded like her brother, David. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, Convinced that someone was in the house, someone who would track dirt on her clean floors. The story now takes us into one of these haunting flashbacks, a more complete and terrifying vision than before. We see Eleanor as a 5-year-old girl. Her father has just remarried a woman named Agnes, a woman with cold eyes and an obsession with cleanliness. Little Eleanor and her 3-year-old brother, David, are clumsy, messy children, a constant source of irritation to their new stepmother. One day, David spills a glass of red juice on Agnes's prized white rug. The rage on Agnes's face is terrifying. She locks Eleanor in her room. Through the door, Eleanor can hear David crying. Then a loud thud. Then silence. Later that night, her father and Agnes tell her that David has gone to live with an aunt in another state. He was a bad boy, they said, and he needed a fresh start. Eleanor never saw her brother again. The memory is saturated with the smell of bleach and the sight of Agnes scrubbing the white rug. 4 hours. A chilling echo of Eleanor's own recent actions. When she snaps back to the present, she is standing in her own kitchen in Maple Creek, a bottle of bleach in her hand, with no memory of having taken it out. Lily is crying in her crib upstairs. The sound grates on Eleanor's nerves. For a terrifying second, Lily's cry sounds like David's. The past and the present are blurring, and the calm, orderly world she has killed to create is beginning to fracture from within. Izzy Rossi, sensing the Vances were nearing a breaking point, decided to increase the pressure. She couldn't find the evidence she needed, so she would have to make them creative for her. She knew that Richard, the narcissist, would be the weaker link. His need for self-preservation would eventually override any loyalty to Eleanor. She arranged for a patrol car to be stationed permanently outside their house, 24/7. It was a constant, visible reminder that they were being watched. Then, she leaked a small. It wasn't a lie, but it was framed to sound as incriminating as possible. The new story aired that evening. The effect was immediate. Richard saw his last hope of controlling the narrative evaporate. His name, his reputation, was being irrevocably tied to a monstrous crime. He confronted Eleanor, his voice a furious whisper, terrified the police car outside might have listening devices. "What did you do, Eleanor? What did you tell them?" He hissed. "I didn't tell them anything," she replied, her voice distant. She was arranging Lily's baby food jars in the pantry, sorting them by color. "There is nothing to tell." "Nothing to tell." Richard's voice rose, cracking with panic. "They're talking about bleach and credit cards. They're building a case. They think we're murderers. We just needed a clean start," she said calmly, not looking at him. "You said so yourself. You said you wished he wasn't here. You said you wanted our family to be perfect. I made it perfect for you. I cleaned up the mess." The cold, simple logic of her statement struck Richard like a physical blow. He stared at her, truly seeing for the first time the depth of the psychosis he had so casually nurtured. He had wanted a problem to go away, and in his place, he had unleashed a monster who had solved it with terrifying finality. He had thought he was the one in control, the master manipulator. Now, he realized he was trapped in the cage with the beast he had created. His own survival was all that mattered now. The carefully constructed partnership of Richard and Eleanor Vance was about to come to a spectacular, violent end. The dam of denial and deception was cracking, and Detective Izzy Rossi knew that one final, decisive push was all it would take to bring it crashing down. The constant surveillance and the targeted media leak had worked exactly as she planned. The Vances were isolated, terrified, and turning on each other. The fortress they had built around their secret was crumbling from the inside out. It was time to execute the final phase of her strategy. She couldn't prove what had happened inside that house, but she could make the house itself reveal its secrets. Her request for a second, more invasive search warrant was granted by a judge in the early hours of the morning. This warrant was different. It didn't just authorize a visual search. It allowed for the dismantling of plumbing, the removal of flooring samples, and a full forensic sweep of the property with advanced chemical and biological detection methods. It was based on the mounting circumstantial evidence, the discovery of Barnaby the bear, the inconsistencies in her statements, the suspicious cleaning, and Mrs. Gable's testimony about the strange noise from the garage, the noise she had described as a wood chipper. Izzy had a sickening hunch about what that sound really was. She decided to execute the warrant at dawn. The element of surprise was crucial. She wanted to catch them off guard, before they had time to coordinate their stories or prepare their emotional defenses. As the first pale light of morning broke over the manicured lawns of Maple Creek, A convoy of police and forensic vehicles rolled silently down Elm Street and converged on the Vance residence. Izzy led the way, her face set with grim determination. She didn't bother knocking. She used a key obtained from the Vance's lawyer and entered the house. Richard and Eleanor were in the kitchen. Caught mid-argument. Their faces, pale and drawn in the morning light, registered shock, then fear, then pure panic. Detective Rossi. Richard stammered, trying to regain his composure. What is the meaning of this? You can't just barge into her home. Izzy held up the signed warrant, her voice cold and official. Mr. Vance, we have a warrant to conduct a forensic search of this property. I'm going to have to ask you and your wife to wait in the living room. You are not to speak to each other. An officer will be with you at all times. The invasion began. The forensic team, clad in sterile white suits, swarmed the house. They moved with a quiet, methodical purpose that was far more terrifying than any loud confrontation. They were no longer just looking. They were deconstructing. In the kitchen, a plumber began carefully taking apart the pipes under the sink, focusing on the P-trap and the garbage disposal unit. In the garage, another team sprayed the pristine concrete floor with luminol, a chemical that reveals the presence of blood, even after it's been thoroughly cleaned. Eleanor watched them from the living room, her body rigid with a terrifying stillness. Her perfect house, her sanctuary, was being violated, its innards exposed to the harsh, judgmental light of the outside world. She wasn't watching the police. She was watching the smudges their boots left on her gleaming hardwood floors, the way their equipment cases might scratch the paint on the walls. Her carefully ordered universe was descending into absolute chaos. Richard sat on the opposite end of the sofa, his head in his hands, the smooth facade of the charming executive completely shattered. He was a cornered animal, and his mind was racing, calculating his own odds of survival. Izzy's attention was focused onto key areas, the kitchen sink and the garage. Mrs. Gable's words echoed in her mind. A wood chipper. No, Richard had said. An electric saw. For cutting a fallen branch. Izzy had checked the city records. There had been no major storm. No reports of significant tree damage on Elm Street in the past month. Another lie. In the garage, the first major breakthrough came. Under the harsh glow of a black light, the luminol-sprayed floor began to emit a ghostly blue luminescence. It was a massive, sprawling pattern, concentrated near a floor drain in the center of the garage. It was the unmistakable signature of a large quantity of blood that had been washed away, its iron traces still clinging to the porous concrete. One of the forensic techs called out to Izzy, "Detective, you need to see this." At the same time, a shout came from the kitchen. "We've got something." Izzy went to the kitchen first. The plumber had disconnected the garbage disposal unit and emptied its contents into a fine mesh sieve. Amidst the foul-smelling sludge of everyday food waste, there were other things. Tiny fragments, hard and white. They were too small to be immediately identifiable. But they were not food. They were bone. She walked into the garage, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the glowing patterns on the floor. A story of horrific violence was written there in invisible ink. The team was also taking samples from the blades of a large, new-looking electric saw that sat on a workbench. Even though it had been wiped down, microscopic traces could still remain. But the key, the irrefutable piece of evidence that would blow the case wide open, was found in the most mundane of places. A young officer, tasked with vacuuming the entire house for trace evidence, was emptying the contents of the vacuum cleaner bag onto a sterile sheet. Amidst the dust, the hair, and the carpet fibers, he saw something small and white. He picked it up carefully with a pair of tweezers. It was a child's tooth, a milk tooth, with a tiny, telltale cavity on its surface. Izzy took the small evidence bag containing the tooth. She already knew. Sarah had mentioned in her first interview that Leo had a cavity, and was scheduled to see the dentist right after Thanksgiving. Dental records would provide a positive identification. This tiny, discarded object was the voice of Leo Vance, crying out from beyond the grave. They had the evidence. They had the location of the crime. Now, they just needed the confession. Izzy walked back into the living room, holding the evidence bag with the tooth in it. She stood before Richard and Eleanor. She didn't say a word. She simply held the bag up for them to see. Richard stared at it, his face turning ashen. His mind, always calculating, saw the end game. There was no way out. No way could cover this. Eleanor's reaction was different. She looked at the tooth. and her expression didn't change. The emptiness in her eyes remained. It was as if she were looking at a pebble, a button, an object with no meaning. Her detachment was the most chilling thing Izzy had ever witnessed. It was the calm of a mind so fractured, so divorced from reality, that the evidence of its own monstrosity had no impact. "It's over, Richard," Izzy said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. Richard broke. A strangled sob escaped his lips. It was her. He gasped, pointing a shaking finger at Eleanor. It was all her idea. "She's sick. She's crazy. I told her to get him help. I told her he needed to go back to his mother. But she wouldn't listen. She was obsessed." Eleanor turned her head slowly and looked at her husband. Her expression was not one of betrayal or anger. It was one of mild curiosity, as if he were a stranger speaking a language she didn't quite understand. "But you said you wanted it," she said, her voice a soft, melodic whisper that cut through the tense silence of the room. "You said you wanted a clean slate. You said he was a mess. I cleaned up the mess for you, Richard. For us. For our family." Her confession, so simple, so horrifyingly logical in its own twisted way, hung in the air. She wasn't confessing to a crime. She was explaining a chore she had completed, a task she had performed out of love. In that moment, the full, monstrous truth was finally laid bare. This wasn't just a murder. It was an act of domestic purification. The revelation of Eleanor's buried past came spilling out, a torrent of fragmented memories that finally coalesced into a coherent, terrifying narrative. As Izzy questioned her, the story of her childhood off the cold stepmother, Agnes, the spilled juice, and the brother who had simply vanished emerged. She spoke of it in a flat, emotionless tone, as if describing a movie she had once seen. "Agnes made the house clean," Eleanor said. "She made the family clean. She took away the problem. That's what you do. When something is dirty, you scrub it until it's gone." The generational trauma had come full circle. The horrific act committed against her brother, which her child's mind had buried and reframed as an act of cleaning, had become the blueprint for her own desperate attempt to achieve perfection. She was not just her mother's daughter. She was her stepmother's creation. The final, sickening piece of the puzzle fell into place when Izzy asked her what she did with the rest of Leo's remains. Eleanor looked toward the kitchen, a faint, serene smile touching her lips. "He's not gone," she said softly. "He's part of our new family. Forever. I made sure of it. Everyone said how delicious my stew was on Sunday. It was my best batch ever. A secret family recipe." The horror of her words settled over the room. A silence so profound it was like a physical presence, sucking all the air and warmth from the perfect house on Elm Street. The confession, once uttered, could not be taken back. The grotesque imagery of Eleanor's secret recipe hung in the room, a poison that contaminated every beautiful object, every lovingly arranged piece of furniture. The forensic team, hearing her words over the police radio, felt a collective wave of revulsion. The officers standing guard over Richard and Eleanor flinched, their faces paling. This was a depth of depravity that even seasoned law enforcement professionals struggled to comprehend. Izzy Rossi, however, remained outwardly composed, her mind working with a cold, clear focus. She had one monster confessing out of a delusional sense of accomplishment. Now she needed to break the other one. Richard was still trying to play the victim, the horrified husband who had been unknowingly married to a psychopath. It was a plausible defense, one a sympathetic jury might even believe. Izzy knew it was a lie. Eleanor may have been the hand that committed the act, but Richard was the voice that had whispered the instructions. "Richard," Izzy said, her voice cutting through his faint sobs. "She says you wanted this. She says you told her to clean up the mess." "That's not what I meant," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "It was a figure of speech. I was frustrated. I meant we should get family counseling, or change the custody agreement. I would never." Izzy took a step closer to him, her eyes locking onto his. "Then what about the text messages, Richard?" He froze. What text messages?" "We'll be getting a warrant for your phones." "Of course. But I'm willing to bet we'll find some interesting conversations. Words of encouragement. Perhaps you telling her how much better life would be without the constant reminder of your failed marriage. You telling her it was time to solve the problem for good." Izzy was bluffing, but it was an educated guess based on his personality. A manipulator like Richard would never be able to resist putting his influence in writing, codifying his control. The color drained from Richard's face. He knew what was on those phones. He had been so clever, using coded language and suggestive phrases. But in the context of a murder investigation, his cleverness would be seen for what it was: incitement. The final wall of his defense crumbled into dust. He had orchestrated his own downfall. The confrontation was over. The truth, in all its sickening detail, had been brought into the light. Izzy read them their Miranda rights, the familiar words sounding surreal in the context of the sun-drenched, perfect living room. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Eleanor listened with the same placid indifference she had shown throughout. The legal ramifications were an abstraction, meaningless concepts from a world she no longer inhabited. Her task was complete. Her world was clean. Richard, on the other hand, collapsed into himself. The charming, confident man was gone, replaced by a whimpering, pathetic shell. The life he had so carefully constructed his career, his reputation, his beautiful home was over. He had sought to erase his past, and in doing so, he had annihilated his future. As the officers led them out of the house in handcuffs, the scene on Elm Street was one of controlled chaos. Neighbors had gathered on their lawns, drawn by the commotion. News crews, alerted by the police scanner, were already setting up their cameras. The walk from the front door to the waiting patrol cars was a gauntlet of flashing lights and shouted questions. Eleanor walked with a strange, almost regal calm. She held her head high, her gaze fixed on some distant point, seemingly oblivious to the spectacle she was causing. She looked like a martyr, not a murderer. Richard stumbled, his face hidden in shame. He was a picture of guilt, his body language a confession in itself. The neighbors who had once admired him now stared with a mixture of horror and contempt. They had been fooled. They had welcomed a monster into their homes, shared meals with him, laughed at his jokes. The betrayal cut deep. As Eleanor was being placed in the back of a squad car, she saw her. Sarah Jenkins. She was standing across the street, behind the police tape, her face a mask of stone. She had been called to the scene by Izzy as soon as the confession was secured. For a long moment, the two women's eyes met. The mother whose son had been stolen, and the woman who had stolen him. There was no hatred in Sarah's eyes. There was only a vast, empty abyss of pain. A black hole of grief so immense that no other emotion could survive in its presence. Eleanor looked away first. She settled into the back of the car, smoothed her sweater, and stared straight ahead as the door closed, sealing her off from the world she had tried so desperately to perfect. The final scene of the climax is a series of quiet, powerful images. The forensic team carefully removing the evidence from the house, the labeled bags containing the bone fragments, the tooth, the dismantled pipes, the tow truck hauling away Richard's sedan and Eleanor's minivan to the impound lot, the officer gently carrying a sleeping baby Lily out of the house, her innocent face a stark contrast to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. She would be placed in temporary custody, another innocent victim in the wreckage of her parents' making. And then, the house itself. Izzy Rossi stood on the lawn and looked back at it. The yellow tape was a garish banner announcing its defilement. The door stood ajar. The lights were still on inside. It no longer looked like a home. It looked like a tomb, a monument to a grotesque obsession. The myth of the perfect blended family had died here, in the most horrific way imaginable. The beautiful house on the corner of Elm and Orchard was now, and forever would be a haunted place, a permanent stain on the pristine postcard of Maple Creek. The climax was over, but the shock waves of this day would radiate outwards for years to come, and the long, painful process of understanding how such a thing could happen had only just begun. In the immediate aftermath of a storm, there is a strange and profound silence. The wind dies down, the rain stops, and the world seems to hold its breath, surveying the devastation. So it was in Maple Creek in the days following the arrests of Richard and Eleanor Vance. The shouting of the reporters faded. The police cars departed. But the silence they left behind was heavy, thick with the weight of an unspeakable truth. The Vance house was sealed. A silent, gray mausoleum on its perfect corner lot. The yellow tape served as a stark, constant reminder, a wound that refused to close. For the residents of Elm Street, the house became an object of both morbid fascination and deep revulsion. Parents would hurry their children past it, shielding their eyes. Teenagers would dare each other to touch the front gate. It was no longer just a house. It was a landmark of local horror, A place where the American dream had curdled into a nightmare. The most immediate and brutal consequence fell upon the neighbors who had attended the potluck. The truth about Eleanor's secret recipe spread through the town like a contagion. They had not just been deceived. They had been made unwitting participants in a monstrous desecration. The knowledge was a poison in their systems. Some were overcome with violent nausea at the memory. Others sat in stunned silence for hours, their minds unable to process the sheer horror. The town's counseling services were inundated with calls. The idyllic community of Maple Creek was now a community in collective trauma, bonded by a shared, gruesome experience. Mrs. Gable, the kind elderly woman who had first voiced her suspicions, stopped sitting on her porch. The view was now unbearable. For Detective Izzy Rossi, the silence that followed the case's resolution was of a different kind. It was the quiet hum of paperwork, of reports being filed, of evidence being catalogued. She had done her job. The monsters were caged. But there was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction of victory. There was only a profound weariness, a deep ache in her soul. She had left Chicago to escape this kind of darkness, the kind that clings to you, that makes you question the very nature of humanity. And she had found it here, lurking behind the most perfect of facades. One evening, she sat in her quiet apartment, a file on the Vance case open on her coffee table. She looked at the booking photos. Richard looked defeated, a deflated balloon of a man. But it was Eleanor's photo that held her gaze. The same placid expression, the same empty eyes. There was no remorse, no understanding of the gravity of her actions. In the sterile environment of the interrogation room, psychiatrists had begun to evaluate her. Their initial reports spoke of complex, deeply rooted trauma and severe dissociative disorders. They talked about how the childhood memory of her brother's disappearance, a memory her mind had violently repressed, had created a psychotic blueprint. When faced with a similar stressor imperfection of her steps in her fractured mind, had defaulted to the only solution it had ever known, erasure, disguised as cleaning. Izzy understood the diagnosis on an intellectual level, but the cold, clinical language could never capture the horror of the act itself. It was an explanation, but it was not an answer. The process of healing, if such a thing was even possible, began in the smallest, most difficult of steps. For Sarah Jenkins, the world had been hollowed out. The confirmation of Leo's death was not a closure, but the beginning of a new, permanent state of grief. The horrific details of his final moments were a torment that played on a loop in her mind. Her initial, frantic energy had collapsed into a profound, crushing weight of sorrow. She found herself in a place she never expected to be, a support group for parents of murdered children, held in the sterile basement of a local church. She sat in a circle of strangers, their faces etched with the same indelible pain she saw in her own mirror. For the first time, she did not have to pretend. She did not have to be strong for friends or family. Here, in this circle of shared tragedy, she could simply fall apart. She spoke of Leo, not of his death, but of his life. She spoke of his goofy laugh, his obsession with dinosaurs, the way he would hum when he was concentrating on his drawings. She spoke of the warmth of his hand in hers, the weight of his head on her shoulder as he fell asleep. As she spoke, the other parents didn't offer platitudes or easy comforts. They simply listened. Their silent, understanding presence a testament to the fact that she was not alone. In this desolate landscape of grief, it was not a cure, but it was a beginning. It was the first time she had been able to speak her son's name, without feeling like she was going to shatter. It was the first breath after being held underwater for too long. The legal proceedings moved forward with a grim, inexorable logic. Richard, seeing no other way out, agreed to a plea bargain. He would plead guilty to charges of accessory to murder and conspiracy, and in exchange for his full testimony against Eleanor, he would be spared the death penalty. His confession was a masterclass in self-serving cowardice. He painted himself as a weak man, a man manipulated and emotionally blackmailed by a deeply disturbed woman. He admitted to planting the ideas, to fostering her obsession, but claimed he never believed she would act on them. He had wanted a problem to disappear, he admitted, but he had imagined a divorce, a custody change and a slaughter. The prosecutor knew it was a sanitized version of the truth, but Richard's testimony was the final nail in the coffin of Eleanor's case. It was a price worth paying to ensure she would never be free. Eleanor's case never went to trial. Based on the overwhelming psychiatric evaluations, she was declared not guilty by reason of insanity. She was deemed a danger to herself and others. A woman so profoundly disconnected from reality that she could not be held criminally responsible for her actions. The verdict was a difficult one for the public to swallow. It felt like a legal loophole, a way for a monster to escape true justice. But for those who had seen her, who had looked into the vacant depths of her eyes, it was the only logical conclusion. She wasn't evil in the way a calculating killer was evil. She was a broken thing, a vessel of inherited trauma that had overflowed with horrific consequences. The story now turns to a quiet, contemplative moment, a pause in the relentless forward march of events. Izzy Rossi finds herself driving down Elm Street late one night. She pulls her car over to the curb across from the Vance house. The property has been sold to a developer who plans to tear it down and build a duplex, an attempt to erase the physical scar from the neighborhood. For now, though, it still stands, dark and empty, a void in the string of warm, well-lit homes. She thinks about the chain of events, the series of small, cruel choices and deep, unhealed wounds that led to this tragedy. She thinks of Richard's selfish desire for a clean slate, a desire so common, so human, yet in his case, so grotesquely enabled. She thinks of Eleanor's childhood, of the little girl who learned that the ultimate act of cleaning was to make a person disappear. She thinks of Leo, a little boy who just wanted to be loved, who became an unacceptable stain in a world of obsessive perfection. This case had changed her. It had stripped away any lingering illusions she had about the safety of a place like Maple Creek. It had taught her that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones that hide in the shadows, but the ones that live in plain sight, smiling at neighborhood potlucks, waving from their front porches. The evil here wasn't born of malice in the traditional sense. It was a byproduct of weakness, of narcissism, of trauma left to fester. It was a quiet, domestic horror, and that, she realized, was the most frightening kind of all. The healing of the community was a slow, uneven process. For some, the horror became a dark piece of local lore, a story to be whispered to newcomers. For others, it was a wound that would never fully heal. The potluck attendees, bound by their shared trauma, formed their own informal support group. They met for coffee. They talked. They tried to make sense of the senseless. They were learning to live with the knowledge that was now a part of them. And for Sarah Jenkins, the path forward began to take shape. Not around forgetting, but around remembering. In her support group, she had met a father whose daughter had been killed in a drunk driving accident. He had started a foundation in his daughter's name, promoting responsible driving. It was a way, he said, to make her life mean something beyond its tragic end. The idea took root in Sarah's heart. She could not bring Leo back, but she could honor his memory. She could create something positive from the depths of her pain. She decided she would start a foundation. Not a grand, national organization, but something small, local, and meaningful. It would be a resource for children caught in the middle of difficult blended family situations. A place where they could find counseling, support, and a voice. It would be a light in the darkness. It would be Leo's light. The decision did not erase her grief, but it gave it a purpose. It was a single, defiant act of creation in the face of absolute destruction. Time, as it always does, moved on. The seasons turned in Maple Creek. The vibrant, wounded autumn gave way to a cold, sterile winter, which eventually surrendered to the tentative green shoots of spring. 2 years passed. The sharp, immediate edges of the tragedy began to soften, not disappearing, but wearing down into a smoother, more permanent feature of the town's collective memory. The Vance house was gone. In its place stood a modern, anonymous duplex, its clean lines and fresh paint a deliberate attempt to overwrite history. New families moved in. Families with no connection to the horror that had transpired on that patch of land. They planted new gardens and hung new porch swings. Life, in its stubborn, resilient way, was reclaiming the space. The lives of those at the center of the storm had found their new, altered shapes. Richard Vance was a ghost in the penal system. He was serving a sentence of 25 years to life in a medium-security prison a few states away. His charm and charisma were useless there. He was just a number, an inmate who kept to himself. The letters he wrote to his lawyer were filled with self-pity and blame, a continuing narrative in which he was the ultimate victim. He never once expressed remorse for Leo. His only sorrow was for himself, for the perfect life he had lost. Eleanor Vance existed in a world without time. She was a permanent resident of a high-security state psychiatric hospital. Her days were a structured, monotonous loop of therapy sessions, medication, and quiet observation. She was a model patient, calm, cooperative, and compliant. Her obsession with cleanliness had found a new outlet in the sterile environment of the institution. She would spend hours polishing the surfaces in her small room, folding her linens into perfect squares. The psychiatrist who worked with her described her as a woman living behind a wall of glass. She could describe the events of that horrific weekend with a chilling, detached clarity. But she was utterly incapable of connecting with the emotion of it. The memory of Leo, and what she had done to him, was like a story she had read about someone else. The broken part of her mind, the part that had committed the atrocity, remained inaccessible, locked away behind a door to which no one, not even Eleanor herself, had the key. The baby, Lily, had been quietly adopted by Eleanor's sister, who lived in California. Her name was changed, and she was being raised in a loving home, blissfully unaware of the dark legacy of her biological parents. She was the one true clean slate, the only innocent to escape the wreckage completely. And Sarah Jenkins had found her purpose. The foundation she had envisioned was now a reality. It was called Leo's Light, operating out of a small, rented office space above a bookstore in downtown Maple Creek. It had become a vital local resource, with a team of volunteer counselors and family therapists. It offered a safe haven for children struggling to navigate the complexities of blended families. They provided a space for kids to talk about their fears, their resentments, their feelings of being an outsider. It wasn't a large or famous charity, but for the dozens of families it had helped, it was a lifeline. Sarah was there almost every day. She was not a counselor, but she was the heart of the organization. She answered the phones. She organized fundraisers. She talked to parents. She had found a way to channel her grief into a powerful, healing force. The pain of losing Leo was a current that still ran deep within her, but now it powered something good, something hopeful. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a creator, a builder, a source of comfort for others. In helping other children find their voice, she was ensuring that her own son's was never truly silenced. Our story concludes not with an ending, but with a quiet continuation. It ends on a bright, breezy afternoon in late spring, at the Maple Creek Community Park. The park is alive with the sounds of a normal Saturday, the squeak of swings, the shouts of children playing tag, the murmur of parents chatting on benches. Sarah Jenkins is here. She is sitting on a bench beneath a young maple tree. The tree is small but healthy. Its new leaves are vibrant, almost translucent green in the sunlight. A small, simple bronze plaque is set in the grass at its base. It reads, "In loving memory of Leo Vance. Let your light shine." This tree, planted by the town a year after his death, has become her place. It is where she comes to feel close to him. She is not alone today. With her is a young girl, about 10 years old, named Chloe. Chloe is one of the children from Leo's Light. She has been struggling with her mother's remarriage, feeling angry and invisible in her new family. Sarah often meets with the children outside of the office, in a more relaxed setting. Chloe is quiet for a long time, watching the other children play. Then she speaks, her voice small. "Did you ever feel like you didn't belong?" Sarah looks from the children playing back to the little maple tree. She thinks of Leo, of his quietness in that perfect house, of the lost look Mrs. Gable had described. "Yes," Sarah says softly, "and my son, Leo. I think he felt that way sometimes, too. It's a very lonely feeling, isn't it?" Chloe nods, her eyes filling with tears. "I just want my old life back." "I know," Sarah says, her voice full of an empathy born from the deepest pain. "We can't get the old life back, but we can learn how to build a new one, a different one. And you don't have to build it alone." She puts an arm around the young girl's shoulders, and Chloe leans against her. A small, silent acknowledgement of trust and comfort. Sarah looks up at the branches of the maple tree, reaching towards the sun. She sees not a memorial to a death, but a symbol of a life that, though cut short, had branched out in ways she could never have imagined, offering shelter and hope to others. A quiet, sad smile touches her lips. It is a smile of peace, of acceptance. It is a smile of a survivor. The camera pulls back slowly, leaving Sarah and Chloe on the bench. It drifts over the park, over the happy, oblivious families, over the rooftops of the quiet suburban homes. The image is one of perfect, ordinary peace. The narrator's voice returns for the final time. A soft and thoughtful coda. The story of the Vance family, and of the house on Elm Street, has now closed. but it leaves us with a profound and unsettling lesson. It teaches us that the most dangerous secrets are not the ones we keep from others, but the ones we keep from ourselves. It is a brutal reminder that the pursuit of perfection is a hungry ghost, and when it is fed by unresolved trauma and selfish desires, it can devour everything in its path: love, innocence, and life itself. The gleaming surfaces of our lives can hide the deepest darkness. So we urge you, look closer. Look beyond the perfect smiles and the manicured lawns. Listen to the quiet children, the ones who seem lost in the shuffle of new families and new beginnings. Pay attention to the silences, for it is often in the things left unsaid that the most desperate truths are crying out to be heard. Sometimes, the most important act of love is not to create a perfect picture, but to make space for the beautiful, messy, and imperfect reality of being human. If this story has touched you, if it has made you think, please consider sharing it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the hidden corners of the human heart. And in the comments below, let us know what you think. What is the true meaning of a perfect family? Your voice matters in this conversation. Thank you for watching. The final shot is of a small maple tree, its leaves rustling gently in the wind, standing as a quiet, living testament to a boy whose light, against all odds, was never truly extinguished.